Hello! Today in this tutorial I will speak about the latest release of Renderman, which is version 23.1, and I will speak in this tutorial what Houdini version you need to use in order to get the most benefits from this update. And I will speak in this tutorial also what you need to know when you want to use Houdini with the Houdini India, especially with the USD limits which are lifted from side effects. There's something you need to know about this, and I will also speak in this tutorial about why it is important that you use the spare parameters on each object. I will show you what impacts are on this. So yeah, and I will talk also about the integrators, more in general, about what you can do with those integrators, why it is important to use the default integrator, which is the path tracer. I will show you how you can use the render filters in Renderman, which is basically something like post effects for color grading and for additional effects that you can create with those filters. And at the end, my final conclusion about Renderman 23.1, and yeah, let us dive into that. So the first thing that you need to know is when you want to use the latest release, especially when you be a non-commercial user, you need to update to the latest build, which is 23.1. When you use at the moment the 23 version, it can happen that the 23 version doesn't work anymore. This is because the non-commercial users can only use the latest release. You can get the latest release quite easily on the Renderman store website, and there are also the upgrade button for the professional users, which is mostly automatic. Not every time on Linux in my experience, but it works a lot better than in the past. And yeah, of course it can also happen that you need to renew the new non-commercial license when you do the upgrade. There is also an important thing that I read on Discord a couple of weeks ago or a couple of days ago, I don't know exactly anymore, which is when you upgrade your computer, or when you, let us say, exchange your motherboard, you need to make sure that you redeem your or delete your Renderman license. When you have any problems with the license, I can only say write to the Renderman sales, which have an email contact, which is also the address to get a copy of the professional build. So when you want to buy it, and I heard in recent time that a lot of you guys have bought it, when you have any problems with the licensing or any specific questions, the support of the Renderman developing team is really awesome, and so you can directly contact them via email. So yeah, this is really nice what they do for you as a customer. So the next important thing is what Houdini version you need to use. So at the moment, the Renderman team is specifically developing for the 287 build, which is the initial release from Houdini. And you need to use this version in order to get all the benefits from the release. You can, of course, update to the latest production release of Houdini. Some of you guys maybe have already done this, but there comes a problem. The current support is only for the initial production build. So when you use the latest production build of Houdini, you get some problems with camera parameters, especially motion blur, because Side Effects has made some dramatic changes in the API. So I believe the developer cannot really catch up the speed that Side Effects is developing their product. But this is okay because Renderman is not only built for Houdini, so the developers at Pixar need to make sure that Renderman is working on all platforms and also on all DCC applications properly. So this is okay for me. I mean, the initial release is about 1 month ago, 1.5 months ago, which is totally fine for me. So I also have to admit that when you use the initial release, there were some specific bugs and also a lot of crashes in the past, but all those crashes have gone. So I didn't found any bugs anymore when you use the Turn-in-87 from Houdini. So also I had to stop the IPR when I rewire something in the material builder. And this was a problem which I've talked about in my recent tutorial, which you also can find on the learning page now under tutorials, the Renderman for Houdini tips. And in that tutorial, some of you guys maybe remember this, I've talked about this specific problem. But yeah, the problems are gone. So this release is really remarkable in my opinion. So as I've said, you need a specific build, but here comes a tiny problem for the Houdini indie users. Side Effects has lifted some of the limitations for the USD files, and those limitations were lifted above the version 300 from Houdini18. So in order to get the benefits of the USD file format, you basically need to install both. So the render version, basically, that's my workaround, and also the latest production release. So I already did this in order to get the benefits of the USD files. And I will show you a workaround right now. So basically, let us say you have one of my scan files which have a lot of geometry. You can create a USD export from your file, because the OBJ files loading times are quite long, so I don't recommend to use OBJ files in production. They are all only an intermediate format, so make sure that you export those files to USD. This makes also sense outside of the LOPS context. And here you can, of course, set the path for your export. Make sure that you, when you have maybe unwrappings and all kinds of attributes, that you check this attributes button. And of course, the other stuff on your liking. So do the export, and when you did that, you can basically jump over to your Turn-in-87 build from Houdini and can load the files right here. And when you load those files, okay, that's my mistake, sorry. Yeah, maybe I should delete them, maybe not. So yeah, you load those files, those USD files, and make sure you check the unpack to polygons. And I found a little trick in order to have the viewport a bit faster. After you made that, you pack them again. You pack them to normal Houdini packed geometries. make sure that you transfer the attribute, and this will speed up a lot in your scene. I mean, normally on OBJ files the scene needs to load 1 minute, and now it loads in about 5 to 10 seconds, which is really great. Also, it decreases the first time to pixels. So I already did a render image with this, and you can see it looks quite realistic. I have a lot of subsurface scattering in this object, in this orange object, and that's why you have a render time of 10 minutes. I also have not the best computer. I mean, I need to upgrade this computer, hopefully this year. Yeah, with Renderman 23.1 comes also a need for the update of your NVIDIA drivers, because when you use NVIDIA 318, for example, you cannot use the denoiser, the denoise preview, which is based on optics. So in order to do that, you need to upgrade this. But when this doesn't work, you get a console notification, which tells you basically that you need to update the drivers. And yeah, so that's basically all you need to do. And I will show you now what you need to do in order to get such a good quality. So first deactivate this, and yeah, the most important thing is that you apply the spare parameters to each object. So when you create a new object, let us say this one, we will deactivate all of this, or maybe I get a sphere. It's maybe better. So I have built everything in real size, so that's why everything needs to be quite tiny. So, or maybe you can let it in that size. So when you start the render process now, you see only a sphere. So let us say we want to apply a glass material. So we go into the Renderman preset browser, which has now a color coding for the factory defaults, the factory library, and your own libraries. And here you can get a nice glass material. Let us add this one, or maybe that one. So now we have glass. So, which is looking okay. So, but here comes a problem. When you deal with subsurface scattering, for example, or when you deal with motion blur and all kinds of effects, or let us say you want to smooth it at render time or subdivide it at render time, you need to add those spare parameters. This is highly important in order to get all the features that the path tracer is providing. So we will stop the render process right now and select the object and go to our render pane, render shelf button, and there's a button called add spare parameters. So add this button, and now you have those right here. Recently I have heard that some guys don't have any options when they hit the button. This can cause when Renderman isn't the first entry in your Houdini environment. So when you go to your settings where you have all your stuff, you get a Houdini environment file. You need to make sure that in the Houdini path that Houdini Renderman is the first entry. So in case you use Arnold or Redshift or any other render engine. make sure that you have this. So, and we can close this. So, when you have pushed this button, you have all kinds of topics or tabs in here. The most important are the trace attributes. So right now, the defaults mean that you only have one diffuse bounce on the GI and subserver scattering and so on the defaults. So in order to have a better lighting in your scene and a more correct way, which is the path tracers working, you need to raise this, so at least to 3. You can also increase the specular, which right now you don't see that much on this, but I will show you what it means when you don't do this. So let us say we add one of the oranges. So here we have it. Let's move it here. Oh no, we don't do that. We will use this one. This one is maybe better. And maybe, yeah, here we have it. As you can see, Renderman isn't crashing anymore, which is quite nice. But now the new sphere is stucking into the orange. So we will move it here, and we'll also activate the subdivision spare parameter. So, I will deactivate depth of field, so it's maybe rendering a bit faster. So here we have it. So it's now a sphere, and it doesn't matter how big the frequency is. It will belong to a sphere, which is awesome. So Renderman will subdivide this sphere until it is smooth. And what I will do now is I will show you what it means when you decrease those values. So I will decrease the diffuse bounces now. And you see that you have no traces anymore. So the specular depth is also important for refractions, and mostly for refractions from what I've seen. So in order to have a realistic result, depending on your object, you have to dial this up. So you get longer render times, of course, but you can dial this up. You have to dial this up. Same for this one. So when you deactivate this, or when you set it to 0, you get no light bounces anymore. So you need to dial this up. And now it's a bit brighter, not really much, but yeah. It also affects the subsurface scattering. So when we look at the orange, and when I go into this section, that's from one of my tests. That isn't right. So when you dial this down, you have no subsurface scattering anymore. So diffuse bounces will impact the quality of your subsurface scattering too, of all the shader operations which are happening inside the object. So this is rendering quite fast because there are no subsurface scattering anymore, and this will also impact, of course, in the refractions. And 3 at least will create much better results. Yeah, this is the first thing that you need to know. So there comes some guys don't understand why this is. At the first time when I discovered this, I also didn't know this, but this has a big advantage. So you can deactivate and even animate those parameters when objects are behind the camera or not that important anymore in the foreground. Maybe you have a very fast scene when you have a lot of motion blur. You can play with those values, and you can also temporarily deactivate some of the effects like the indirect visibility, which will lead that your object is not shown anymore in refractions and also reflections. So indirect visibility affects all indirect lighting effects, lighting rays. The transmission will affect the shadow rays. For example, when you have a very dense scene or a city scene or a landscape where you have a scene fog, maybe you only want to give a specific sense of depth in your scene. You can play with those values in order to save a lot of render time, because when you only want to make the objects in very far distance a bit more grayish or more placed in the fog, you don't really need to have perfect refractions in the volume or something like this. So those parameters are important. So they are also affect, of course, the refractions and so on. There are also the parameters for motion blur. So when you want to render motion blur, also when you want to have the motion blur into your motion vectors, you need to play with those values. And yeah, there are some specifics for maths. You can also, let us say you have an object which has problems with normals and so on, you can try those options. You can reverse the orientation, for example. So yeah, that's up to you. But when you deal with that, for example, you need to make sure that it is working with your shader, because some shader operations require a double-sided or a double-sided rendering, for example, transmission and so on. So yeah, there are also some other useful options right here. For example, the point scale, which is p-scale. In fact, p-scale will also work automatically, but this is a multiplicator. You can force to smooth the normals. Also, you can force the render engine to smooth displacement. And like I said, you render polygons, a subdivision option, and so on. Some stuff for curve rendering, and so on and so on. You can basically test this out, but this is quite important. And that means when you don't add those spare parameters, you don't have correct GI and also not correct refractions at some certain point. So this is really important. So with Renderman comes also some stuff that I don't understand in the first place, but which is quite nice. You have different integrators. So basically, Renderman comes with different render engines in one product. So you can change the integrator. The default one is the path tracer. So you have to add the integrator right here. You cannot render an image without the integrator. I mean, you can, but you don't get any shading at all. So you have to use it right here. I personally, when I do render color mattes, so for compositing, in a separate render path, I don't use any integrator, because that's the fastest way to render the image when you only want to have color mattes, for example. So the default one is the path tracer, and when you dive into the path tracer, you have different options for, maybe you can force Renderman to specifically stop rendering any light bounces, any shading bounces beyond 2. So you set it to 2. So every bounce beyond this value will not appear in the render process. So we can test this. And so when we dial this down, you see you don't have any reflections anymore at the first bounce. So when I set this to 0, you see you have also no subsurface scattering anymore. All those effects are gone. The image is rendering extremely fast. So here you can also activate the allow caustics function. So you can render caustics when you have enough bounces. And here you have a bit of the caustic effect, but the lighting is not sufficient for any of this stuff. So okay, yeah, it's now darker, and when I check this, it's much brighter. So caustics really not have any drastic impact on the render time, which is quite awesome. Most of my images are rendered with caustics. And of course, you can accumulate your opacity, maybe when you render volumes and so on. You can change the indirect clamping, which is quite important and also significant when you only need to deliver rough images, rough quality, so nothing for high-end quality. It also has impact to change one of those parameters on the denoising. So in the past, I dialed this down often to 3, which can decrease your render time. You can also read the tooltips on each of those handles. Yeah, you can learn a lot from those tooltips. But when you want to have the maximum quality and the best denoising result, you should use the defaults. But one exception to this: when you want to render volumes, let us say you want to render clouds, you need to raise those values, and you do this in the integrator. There is no option in the RIS node itself. So all those will be handled in the integrator. But of course, there are also other integrators available. So by the way, those integrators will be stored in the shop context inside the RIS network. So you can also add another integrator from the menu. You can of course change to the occlusion context. So you basically render your entire scene only with ambient occlusion. And yeah, maybe you want to have a preview pass for blocking your scene or something like this. This is very, very fast. And of course, yeah, you can also use the albedo. You can change some of those settings in order to change the look of your occlusion. You can increase the number of samples, of course. The uniform one is the fastest. This is crazy. And of course, you have also other integrators like the direct lighting, which only will render direct lighting. So when you don't need any refraction, when you don't want to have subsurface scattering, reflections, and so refractions, you can use the direct integrator. The reflections that you see right here are only the HDR reflections from the dome light. So when I will deactivate this, you will see that you see, of course, speculars, but you cannot see any reflections anymore. So yeah, sometimes this is good for maybe you do an animatic or something like this. Animatics for a pre-cut. This is the way to use, in my opinion, because it has no impact on your shading result when you do the final render. So you have also the VCM integrator, which is quite important, I guess, when you deal with physical correct caustic results, or absolutely physical caustics result, because the VCM is using a completely other method to render the images. It can be slower, but it also can be faster. So you need to look what integrator you want to use. The most integrated and the best integrated is the path tracer. All the productions from ILM to MPC are using the path tracer. So keep that in mind. The VCM has also a big disadvantage because it uses a lot of memory in order to render your image. So let us move back to the path tracer. So, okay, I will restart. Sometimes you need to restart the entire process. And I want to deactivate the dome light again. So here we have nice lighting. And now you can do also another nice trick with Renderman. You can use those render filters. I don't specifically mean the light filters, I mean the render filters. And they are really, really nice. So you can create different filters right here. You can find them in the RIS network. There you find a background filter, a cryptomatte filter. So when you use cryptomatte, you need to use them. Filmic tone mapping, a grade tool, and so on. And they divide it into two parts, or into two versions. The first one with those tiny dots inside of this simple camera are the sample filters, sampling filters. They really have impact on your render result. So they are altering, from what I've seen, altering the way how the image is processed. So when you use, for example, the sampling tone mapper, you can save render time. So for example, you have a very contrasty image where you have a lot of blacks in your image, or when you dial down your image, or when you tone your image in the way that your image become very contrasty, it can happen that your render time will be reduced, because under a specific amount, Renderman will not sample anymore, or at some specific settings. So that's the reason why you have two. The other one is the display filter, which only changes the image after the sampling process. And you can, of course, also add a watermark to all of your renderings. You can change white points. So you basically can, you can bring Renderman to output realistic images. What you don't have at the moment are stuff like lens reflections and all kinds of blooming and so on. This is something you will not find in the filters, because in my opinion, this is something that you better do in post. So, but I will show you the impact of this stuff. So let us get rid of those direct lighting stuff. Don't need that right now. So where you use this sampling filter. You go into your RIS node, and in the RIS node, you have a new tab or a tab called Advanced. And under Advanced, you have a tiny section called Filters. And there are the slots for the display filter and the sampling filters. You also can, of course, mix different. So here we have it now. So no link. So in order to use them, you basically only need to drag and drop them into the field right here. You can also create those filters which are called sample filter combiner. So with the combiner, you can use multiple versions of this. So you basically can create another sample filter, which is right here. Let us use the grade sample filter, and we can put them in here. And then we put this one in here. So we have a combination now of those. So here you have it. You can change the entire white point of your scene. So you can basically match your footage. Maybe you have a VFX shot and you can match your footage with those stuff. Yeah. And the nice thing is, of course, you have also the filmic adoption of the tone mapper. The filmic, when I remember correctly, was introduced first in Blender Cycles, I guess, or I remember it from Blender Cycles, from one of the developers from the filmic display transform. So, and here you can basically alter your image. The nice thing right now is I use the sample filter, which directly impacts the render result because light rays will be processed through this tone mapper. This will, this creates really, really realistic images. So we can maybe change this here. So we have a bit more contrast. So I like those speculars. You also have in Renderman a completely new option in your shader. Which comes with 23.1, you can now set a different roughness value for your refractions when you use the glass option. On the fruit examples that I've scanned, I use the glass reflection options because this is much more realistic, but of course has a bit more render time, but the results are quite, it looks like a photo in my opinion. So we have ACCG. Okay, this is a bit too reddish. So ACCG. Yeah, it looks like a photo. And yeah, I will finally come to the conclusion. When Renderman 23 appeared as initial release, there were a lot of bugs which leads to crashes. But what I really like is that all of those major crashes and problems are gone. So I can demonstrate it right here. I can disconnect this and you immediately get an update. No crashing anymore. No of this hackery stuff when you need to stop the IPR. I also see that there is no difference anymore with the IPR and the render button here. In 23 and also in 22 there was a problem that the result looks completely different to the IPR and the when you push this render button. Those problems are gone, and this is really awesome. So you also can use now without crashing those debugging options. So yeah, you can check the debug button in the shader, and you see your in that case your diffuse paths. And you can also use multiple debugging at the same time, and no crashes. So some of the parameters aren't working. So roughness is working and albedo is working, or diffuse. I believe the subsurface scattering isn't really working, but I'm not sure anymore. Yeah, only the BXDF stuff is working, I guess. So, and the updates are really awesome. This will also not work. Yeah, this will also not work. Yeah. So, but you can, when you want to see what you added here, you can create a temporary BXDF, the constant shader, and you can of course check the, I don't know if this is working, I guess I never. So, but in that example, when you completely rewired your entire shader to the output collection, you need of course restart your IPR. But then yeah, then you can see the other maps, and this is really working. So this is the roughness path, and here's the scattering float. Yeah, no crashes anymore, and this is really awesome. So of course we need to restart this. And here we have it again. So I will show you now what surprised me the most with my San Francisco scene. Some of you guys will remember this scene. And like I've said in the introduction, there was a problem in the past that not only in Renderman, I had those issues also in Redshift, and also in Mantra back then in Houdini 17.5, that that there was an overhead when you stop a render IPR with a lot of instances. So in Renderman 23, there was the problem that when you use the IPR, you need to basically deactivate all those instances. I mean, those are 127,000 instance points for the viewing area. I guess I have deleted some in order to optimize, but this is not really needed anymore. I need to update the scene. I didn't done anything since Houdini 17. So yeah, but there was a problem, like I've said. So when you started the IPR, invalid camera. Oh my god, this was the problem. Wrong camera, my bad. So this was really my bad. So yet again, so now we have image. So the first time to pixel is really fast, so we can watch it right here, and So we are right now at 15, 16, 17, and about 19 the image should render. So right now, so here it comes. So, and the crazy thing was in the past, you see all those scattered trees right here. I mean, there are a lot of trees. So in the past, when I stopped the IPR, it was crashing or very slow and not responsive. And now you see I hit the stop button and the render process has stopped. This is a dream come true. So here again. And even with this big scene, I mean, I have about 35 gigabytes of textures. I hope I remembered it correctly. 36 gigabytes of texture data in that shot. And you see how fast this stuff is updating. Anyways, I hope you learned what's important when you use Renderman, and I hope you have fun with this tutorial, and I believe I will do more tutorials in the future. It's sometimes quite hard to find time to make tutorials because I work on a lot of projects. And yeah, I hope you have fun with this and see you soon again. Bye.